I work the night shift at Hollow Grove Cemetery, and the rules here are the only things keeping me alive. I can still remember my first night like it was yesterday, though in truth, the memory feels more like a warning than a memory. A cautionary whisper echoing through the fog that blankets the old graves. That evening, the air was cold, damp, and carried the faint, sour scent of decaying leaves. The wind threaded its way through the twisted oaks, rattling dry branches against weathered headstones, and somewhere far off, an animal, or perhaps something else, let out a long, hollow howl that seemed to vibrate through the soil itself. I had just started my patrol, my flashlight cutting a narrow path of light through the gray haze rolling over the cemetery grounds. Every step crunched softly against the gravel paths, yet the silence felt heavier than the sound of my own boots. The tombstones leaned at odd angles, some cracked, some toppled, their inscriptions worn nearly smooth by decades of rain and frost. Even the caretaker's shed, with its faint lantern flickering in the window, seemed distant, unwelcoming. It wasn't loneliness that gripped me. It was a quiet, insistent feeling that the cemetery was alive, watching, aware of every movement I made. I had been told, in passing, that Hollow Grove had its rules. They weren't written anywhere, at least not officially, but every night shift worker knew them, if only through hushed warnings and stories whispered at the edge of the grounds. Never approach the east wing after midnight, one old guard had told me, voice low, eyes flicking to the shadows beyond the chapel. And whatever you do, don't linger near the crypts if the fog rolls in. I nodded, half skeptical, but something in his tone made the hairs on my neck rise. That first night, I thought I understood the rules, caution, respect, simple procedures. But as I walked past the ancient stones, past mausoleums draped in ivy, past graves so old they seemed almost forgotten, I felt the first stirrings of unease. Something watched me from the corners of the fog, shifting just beyond the edge of the flashlight's glow. I couldn't tell if it was the wind, or the trees, or something far older, far more patient. I kept moving, mechanically, repeating the rules under my breath like a mantra, and yet, deep down, I knew that Hollow Grove had more in store than I could imagine. That night, the cemetery didn't just welcome me, it tested me, and I would learn, in time, that the rules were not mere precautions, they were lifelines. The next few nights at Hollow Grove Cemetery were a mix of monotony and quiet unease, the kind that seeps into your bones without ever announcing itself. From the moment I arrived, I realized this was no ordinary cemetery. The paths were overgrown, gravel cracked and scattered with dead leaves that clung stubbornly to the soil. Mausoleums, blackened and crumbling, leaned as if whispering secrets to each other across the fog, and wrought iron fences twisted into grotesque shapes, their sharp points catching faint light in unsettling ways. Even in the daylight, the place had a heaviness about it, a sense that history lingered not just in memory, but in some stubborn, spectral form. My role was simple, on paper: patrol the graves, check the locks on the crypts, assist any visitors who happened to wander in, and report anything out of the ordinary. But in practice, even routine tasks carried weight. Each time I walked between the rows of headstones, I had to keep my attention split between the usual hazards, loose stones, hidden roots, and the strange, subtle oddities that were whispered about by the town. Reports of lights flickering in the fog, grave markers mysteriously moved, and soft, fleeting voices carried through the night had been logged more than once. Older guards spoke quietly about these incidents, but official reports rarely mentioned them. Something about Hollow Grove demanded discretion. The night guard I worked with, a veteran named Harris, had seen more than his fair share of the cemetery's peculiarities. He moved slowly, deliberately, always scanning the shadows, and he never dismissed anything as coincidence. The groundskeeper, a wiry man named Lowell, was mostly silent, But his eyes flicked toward the mausoleums as if they were old acquaintances, and dangerous ones at that. And then there was the caretaker, an older man with a crooked back and a voice like dry leaves. He spoke in riddles, warning me with half-smiles. Some stones remember. Some stones never forget. And some, well, they watch for intruders. I nodded politely, unsure whether to be reassured or terrified. One evening, as I drove the narrow cemetery road in my patrol car, the fog thickened and the gravel crunched sharply under the tires. Between two leaning headstones, I noticed the figure standing perfectly still, its form obscured by mist. I flicked the headlights toward it, heart pacing, and when I approached, there was nothing. No figure, no footprints, just the cold stillness of the graveyard. The air seemed heavier in that spot, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard a whisper carried on the wind. A voice too soft to understand, but clear enough to make my skin crawl. Even ordinary nights felt charged with a subtle dread. A visitor who dared to wander into the cemetery after dusk might laugh off the shadows or the rustling leaves. But for those of us who patrolled the grounds, the sense of being watched was constant. Hollow Grove was a place of rules, unwritten, unspoken, but the consequences of ignoring them were palpable. I began to realize that the cemetery was not merely a resting place for the dead. It was a domain, and in that domain, the living were always under scrutiny. The first rule was simple, or at least it sounded simple when the caretaker told me. Never enter a mausoleum alone at night. At the time, I nodded politely, chalking it up to superstition, or the kind of paranoia that naturally comes with working graveyards. But Hollow Grove had a way of teaching lessons the hard way, and it didn't wait for me to catch up. It was my third week on night shift when the first real test of that rule arrived. A minor security alert came through the radio. An unusual noise reported near one of the older mausoleums on the east side. Alone on patrol, I hesitated at the threshold of the gravel path leading there, fog curling around the broken iron gates like lazy fingers. My flashlight cut through the mist, the beam trembling slightly in my grip. I reminded myself it was probably nothing, a raccoon or a loose branch tapping against stone. But even as I spoke the thought aloud, a chill ran down my spine. Inside the mausoleum, the air was heavy, almost viscous. My footsteps echoed sharply, bouncing off the marble walls, the sound swallowing my own breathing. Shadows stretched long and dark, twisting with the flicker of my flashlight. I rounded a column and froze. Behind it, something moved, subtle, deliberate, and silent enough that it could have been my imagination. A soft scraping echoed across the stone floor, like claws or nails brushing against the tombs. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming to retreat. Stories of previous night guards who had ignored the rule surfaced in my mind. They had entered alone, they had laughed at warnings, and they had vanished. Their disappearances were whispered among the groundskeepers, recorded in no official report, leaving only rumors and empty mausoleums behind. That knowledge tightened around my chest, heavier than the fog itself. The shadow shifted again, more purposeful this time, as if aware of my gaze. My hand tightened on the flashlight, but I didn't move forward. I had a choice: step further in, alone, and risk whatever had claimed the last fool who tried, or retreat, follow the protocol, and survive. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, the floor stone cold beneath my shoes, and my breath visible in the damp air. Outside, the fog was calm, almost inviting, but the mausoleum behind me seemed alive, watching, waiting. That night, the rule ceased to be a superstition. I understood with a sinking certainty that some rules were written not on paper, but in survival, etched into the very air of Hollow Grove Cemetery. I never doubted again, and from that moment on, the warning echoed in my mind like a mantra whenever I patrolled. Never enter a mausoleum alone at night. The second rule came with a sharper edge than the first. Do not disturb fresh graves after dark, no matter the reason. At first, I thought it was common sense. Who would dig at night in a cemetery without a very good reason? Hollow Grove, however, had a way of turning even common sense into a matter of survival. One night, while patrolling the northern section, I noticed a faint glow behind a freshly dug plot near the cemetery's oldest section. At first, I thought a flashlight had been left behind, but as I drew closer, I saw movement. A lone figure bent over the mound, hands working frantically. My heart picked up, and I instinctively reached for the radio, only to realize I was alone on this path. From the shadows, old Tom, the veteran night guard, emerged quietly. He raised a hand, signaling me to stay back. His eyes, pale in the lantern's light, were serious, unreadable. I whispered, "Should I call the police?" He shook his head, gesturing toward the radio box a few yards away. "Not yet. We don't approach. You call them from the safe zone. Let them dig their own graves if they must." I obeyed, moving slowly to the station, every step on the soft earth sounding like a drumbeat in the still night. Behind me, faint whispers drifted on the wind, almost forming words I could not decipher. The ground seemed to breathe beneath my boots, the disturbed soil shifting subtly, as if alive. The wind twisted among the trees and tombstones, creating ghostly patterns in the fog that swirled around my ankles. From my safe vantage, I watched the figure continue, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the rules I had come to respect. Tom remained silent, his presence a steady anchor against the rising panic in my chest. I could feel the weight of the cemetery pressing down, the history of vanished souls and broken rules reminding me why these protocols existed. That night, I understood the gravity of the second rule. It was not merely about propriety or respect, it was about survival. Graves dug after dark were not ordinary. They were boundaries, warnings, thresholds. Crossing them invited attention from forces I could not name, and the cemetery made sure everyone understood, eventually, the cost of ignoring its rules. By the time the authorities arrived, the figure had vanished, leaving only the freshly turned earth and a deep sense of dread. I stayed with Tom a while longer, silent and watchful, knowing that Hollow Grove had marked me as a witness, and perhaps as a potential participant if I ever forgot the rules. By the third night, I was beginning to understand that the rules of Hollow Grove Cemetery were not merely suggestions. They were shields, barely keeping the darkness at bay. Rule 3, however, demonstrated this in a way I could never ignore. Do not touch items left on graves or inside mausoleums. It happened just past midnight, a clear, cold night with the fog curling low over the graves. I was accompanying Mark, a rookie guard, on a routine perimeter check near the west wing. The mausoleums there were ancient, their stonework cracked and blackened with moss. As we approached a recently dug grave, Mark's flashlight caught on something small, glinting faintly in the beam. A trinket, a child's toy perhaps, placed neatly atop the freshly turned soil. Mark bent over, curiosity overwhelming caution. "Just a quick look," he whispered, picking it up. The moment his fingers touched the object, the temperature around us dropped sharply. My breath came out in misty clouds, and the lights of our flashlights began to flicker violently, rhythmically, as if some invisible hand was testing our resolve. Then the sounds began. A series of soft, deliberate footsteps echoed behind us, though we were alone on the path. The distant wind through the trees swirled strangely, forming patterns that looked almost like shadows reaching toward us. I shouted Mark's name, but my voice felt swallowed by the night. Suddenly a loud slam reverberated through the mausoleum doors, the sound so sharp it made my ears ring. The trinket vanished from Mark's hand, as if it had never existed, leaving only his trembling fingers and a wide-eyed stare. I reached for him, steadying his shoulders, but he could barely speak, muttering about hearing whispers calling his name from the darkness. I realized, with a knot tightening in my stomach, that the rule wasn't about superstition or respect. It was about survival. Objects left in the cemetery were not forgotten relics. They were warnings, lures, or perhaps traps. Every cautionary tale I had been told suddenly became vivid. Prior guards who ignored these rules never returned to recount their mistakes. The air around us pulsed with unspoken menace, and I could almost feel unseen eyes following our every movement. For the rest of the night, we avoided the grave entirely, patrolling the surrounding area in tense silence. Mark kept his distance from anything that might have been left behind, and I could see the terror etched into his features. I understood, more clearly than ever, why the rules escalated in seriousness with each violation. A single misstep could invite forces beyond comprehension, forces that Hollow Grove Cemetery seemed to cultivate with patience and precision. By the time dawn approached, Mark was pale and shaken, and I was left with a chilling understanding. The rules weren't just for protection. They were the only thing keeping us from becoming part of the cemetery's quiet, endless collection of lost souls. By the fourth night, the rules of Hollow Grove Cemetery were no longer suggestions. They had become a framework for survival, etched into my mind with every unsettling encounter. Rule 4 carried a weight I hadn't fully appreciated until the night the whispers drew me toward the woods near the old crypts. The admonition was clear: never follow sounds or figures into restricted areas of the cemetery. Yet, the line between duty and curiosity can blur when a voice you recognize calls your name from the shadows. It began with a faint murmur, almost carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the trees rattling and the fog whispering through the broken branches. Then the voice sharpened, distinct, familiar, and almost pleading. "Jamie, over here." It was my name, spoken with a tone I knew, yet distant, hollow. My pulse quickened. Part of me knew I should turn and retreat immediately, call for backup or simply ignore it. Another part, the part still clinging to reason, wondered if someone was in trouble, a lost visitor or perhaps a fellow guard. I froze, scanning the tree line. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the trunks, twisting with the movement of the fog. A faint lantern glow appeared, swinging gently, bobbing as if carried by someone or something just beyond my line of sight. The forest floor seemed to undulate beneath my feet, roots forming shapes that resembled hands reaching for me, or perhaps for whoever had called out. The whispers grew, circling around me, teasing, coaxing. Every instinct screamed to step back, yet my training, my sense of responsibility, pressed me forward. I whispered to myself the rule as a mantra: never follow sounds or figures into restricted areas. The repetition was grounding, anchoring me to the path I knew was safe. Still, the voice called again, and for a moment, my resolve wavered. What if ignoring it meant abandoning someone in danger? What if the darkness was clever enough to use familiarity against me? Then, the shadows shifted violently. The lantern glow flickered and multiplied, revealing several figures, tall, indistinct, their faces obscured. One figure mimicked the posture of the voice I had recognized, but the movement was wrong, jerky, like a puppet. A chill raced down my spine as the whispers crescendoed, overlapping, layered, making it impossible to discern the real from the illusion. I gritted my teeth and stepped back slowly, deliberately. Each breath was shallow, my heart hammering. I reminded myself, rules exist to keep you alive. Following the sound could lead to traps, illusions, or forces beyond comprehension. As soon as I put distance between myself and the woods, the shadows receded, the lantern glow vanished, and the voice fell silent, leaving only the rustling leaves and my rapid breathing. The rest of the night, I patrolled the perimeter on solid ground, avoiding the restricted zones entirely. My hands shook as I relayed a false calm to the rookie, who had been shadowing me, careful not to convey the terror I had just witnessed. That night, I understood that the cemetery didn't merely punish curiosity, it manipulated it, luring the unaware into places they were never meant to tread. Following sounds or figures was not just dangerous, it was invitation enough for the darkness to reach out and claim its due. By sunrise, the whispers were gone, but their echo remained in my mind. I knew, without a doubt, that every rule existed for survival, and every temptation ignored could mean the difference between life and something far worse. By the fifth night, I had begun to understand that Hollow Grove Cemetery was unforgiving, not only to the curious, but to the unprepared. Rule 5, simple as it sounded, always check your equipment and radio. Failure could be fatal, was one of those instructions that seemed mundane until the night proved otherwise. That night, I discovered just how quickly a small oversight could escalate into a nightmare. I had been patrolling the far end of the cemetery, near the isolated section of old gravestones that slanted like crooked teeth against the fog. The radio in my patrol car crackled faintly, but the battery was weak. I noticed the flashlight flickering as I stepped out to inspect a minor disturbance reported by a sensor. At first, I shrugged it off, telling myself I had enough experience to make do. But experience, I was about to learn, was a poor substitute for functioning equipment here. The car had barely settled when it stuttered to a halt. The engine coughed and died, leaving me in near-complete darkness. My flashlight gave one final flicker before going out entirely, plunging me into blackness. The wind rustled through the broken branches of the trees, carrying with it whispers that had begun to feel familiar, quiet admonishments from the shadows themselves. And then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, a faint glow flickered behind the windows of a nearby mausoleum. I squinted, trying to understand, but it wasn't lantern light. The illumination pulsed, almost as if it were breathing, revealing the faint outline of a figure in the glass, one that wasn't there when I blinked. The hairs on my neck prickled. My fingers fumbled over the controls of my flashlight, desperate to restore its beam. I cursed silently, realizing that if it had failed just a few steps earlier, I might have stumbled into something far worse. In that moment, shadows began to stir along the edge of the cemetery, elongated and formless. They moved with a precision that made no sense, silent, deliberate, and unnervingly human in their posture. I could feel the pull of instinct urging me to run, to seek the car's safety, but the engine would not restart. To myself, a mantra. Check your equipment. Always check your equipment. With trembling hands, I retrieved a spare flashlight from my patrol bag, fumbling with batteries and switches. The light sputtered to life, narrow but sufficient to illuminate the immediate area. Immediately the shadows retreated, leaving only the fog and the mausoleum with its strange pulsing glow. I realized with a cold dread that the figure in the window had been a reflection. But of what? I couldn't say. No one else was there, yet the sensation of being watched was unmistakable, lingering, as if the cemetery itself had eyes. The rest of the patrol was tense, every noise amplified, every movement suspicious. When I finally reached the main road and the car's engine reluctantly turned over, I double-checked all equipment and radios. Each switch, each battery, each connection. Everything that could fail and potentially cost a life had been scrutinized. Rule 5 was no longer theory, it was survival. That night, I understood that at Hollow Grove Cemetery, preparedness wasn't a suggestion. It was armor. And without it, the darkness didn't simply hide you. It found you, studied you, and toyed with you until your mistakes became its advantage. By now, I had learned that Hollow Grove Cemetery was not merely a graveyard, it was a web of unspoken laws, each one designed to keep the living from becoming part of its silent population. Rule 6, in particular, was one that I'd never taken seriously until that night. Never trust someone offering guidance or help after dark. It seemed almost polite, almost mundane, a caution against strangers. But it was, as I would soon discover, a rule forged in survival. I had just completed a routine patrol near the western boundary, where the grave sloped into dense woods. The fog had thickened, curling like fingers around the gravestones, blurring the path ahead. I was in the car, trying to start the engine to move to a safer position, when a figure appeared on the road ahead, bathed in the milky glow of the fog. At first, I thought it was a townsperson who had wandered off. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward a narrow, twisting trail through the older graves. "This way," the voice called, calm, almost melodic. "You'll get through faster if you follow me." I felt the pull of instinct, the natural human inclination to trust another, especially in uncertainty. But my hand hovered over the radio, hesitating. I recalled Rule 6 instantly, the words echoing in my mind. Never trust someone offering guidance or help after dark. My pulse quickened as I watched the figure step closer. Yet the mist seemed to swallow their lower half. The road around me warped in the fog, lights bending, shadows lengthening unnaturally. The engine sputtered violently and died. My flashlight flickered, then dimmed almost completely. The figure's face came into view briefly. A human shape, yes, but the features, twisted, elongated, as if the fog itself had pulled their face into a mockery of flesh. My stomach dropped, and my hands clenched the steering wheel. That split second of hesitation, that choice to trust my instincts over the lure of guidance, saved me. I reversed slowly, keeping my distance, refusing to step out or follow. The figure's lips twisted into a grin that no human expression could hold, and then it was gone, vanishing into the mist as suddenly as it had appeared. My breath came in shallow gasps. The fog swirled around the car like a living thing, whispering and curling against the metal. I restarted the engine on the second attempt, moving back toward the main path, but the unease lingered, deeper than anything I'd experienced before. The cemetery was patient, it seemed, allowing me this narrow escape to understand the gravity of the rule. That night, I understood the lesson clearly. The rules were not mere bureaucracy or tradition. They were shields, protocols designed to protect the living from the subtle, predatory intelligence that haunted Hollow Grove after dark. Trusting another, anyone, could mean losing your way, your sense of reality, perhaps even your life. Every flicker of light, every shadow, every voice calling from the fog, was potentially a test, a trap. I parked near the caretaker's shed, heart still hammering, shaking out the cold and the fear. I realized, in that moment, that the rules were evolving with the cemetery itself. And to survive here, I would need to treat each one with the reverence and caution of a sacred commandment. Hesitation, discernment, and obedience were not choices. They were lifelines. By the time I reached the eastern boundary of Hollow Grove, the night had become something alive, something that seemed to watch me, breathe around me, and wait for the slightest misstep. The fog thickened until the mausoleums and gravestones were mere silhouettes, their edges softened, twisting with shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a low cry echoed, a child's voice, or maybe a whisper imitating one. I couldn't tell. Every instinct screamed at me, "Stay back, stay in control. Follow the rules." I whispered them under my breath like a mantra, letting each one settle in my mind. Never enter a mausoleum alone. Do not disturb graves. Do not touch items. Never follow sounds. Always check your equipment. Never trust guidance after dark. Each word was a tether, a lifeline keeping me from slipping into panic. The patrol car sputtered and groaned as I tried to drive along the winding path. The engine cut out entirely at the crest of a hill, leaving me stranded in a stretch of overgrown graves. I grabbed the flashlight, shaking, and tried to illuminate the path ahead. That's when I saw it. Shadows flitting among the tombstones, moving with unnatural speed, twisting like smoke. For a moment, I froze, heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, circling, incomprehensible yet personal, as if naming me aloud. I reminded myself of Rule 4, never follow sounds or figures into restricted areas. And yet, the instinct to investigate, always dangerous, crept forward, tempting me. A lantern glow appeared briefly among the crypts, and a figure stepped into view. Calm, casual, gesturing toward the fog-drenched path. My pulse hammered. It was the exact scenario Rule 6 warned against. A stranger offering guidance when none should be trusted. I hesitated, flashlight trembling in my grip, and the figure's features twisted as though the fog had reshaped them, a distorted human mockery, smiling in a way that was too wide, too unnatural. I whispered the rules again, steadying my breath, reminding myself to obey, not to trust. I ducked behind a low mausoleum, hearing the ground behind me shift slightly. I glanced back. Graves along the path seemed to open just a fraction, the earth trembling like it was breathing. My mind raced, panic clawing at my thoughts, yet I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, remembering Rule 5, check equipment. My radio crackled with static. The light on my flashlight flickered, but the ritual of checking and adjusting kept me grounded, like a tether to reality. Every step forward was measured. Shadows leapt across my periphery. Objects shifted subtly. The iron gates rattled. Urns tipped without wind. A stone statue seemed to inch closer. Each time I whispered the rules, letting them guide my movements. A misstep here could have been fatal. My feet brushed over uneven soil, avoiding the partially opened graves, the ghostly lights reflecting in the mausoleum windows, sometimes showing a figure that was not there when I looked directly. The cemetery tested me at every turn, and I realized then that the rules were not just advice. They were the only armor against a place that wanted to claim you whole. I maneuvered through the twisting paths, edging between the crypts, the fog, and the unseen watchers. Every time the whispers grew closer, I recalled the older guard's words: obedience, hesitation, discernment. They were not suggestions. They were the difference between survival and vanishing, like the previous Nighshift guards, whose names were now part of Hollow Grove's secrets. The figure offering guidance appeared again, this time closer, extending a hand. I averted my eyes, sticking rigidly to the path I had charted in my mind, muttering the rules like a prayer. The hand disappeared as I passed, leaving only a cold, lingering air, as if the cemetery exhaled in disappointment. At last, I reached the caretaker's shed, the fog thinning slightly as dawn approached. My hands shook, body drenched in cold sweat, but I was alive. Every shadow, every whisper, every misdirection had tested me, and yet, by remembering the rules, I had survived. I realized then that the rules were not mere superstition. They were survival, trust and protocol, when all else, including logic, failed. The night had peaked in terror, but I had learned to navigate the chaos, to hold my mind steady even when reality warped around me. I parked the car, heart still racing, and finally allowed myself a shuddering breath. Hollow Grove had shown me its teeth, and I had not faltered. But I knew the night was only a beginning. The cemetery had many more lessons, many more rules, waiting in the dark. And I, for all my vigilance, was only beginning to understand the depth of what it meant to work the night shift here. The first pale light of dawn crept over Hollow Grove Cemetery, and for a moment the world seemed normal again. The mist lifted just enough to reveal the gravestones and mausoleums in the soft, forgiving glow of early morning. I parked the patrol car near the caretaker's shed, but even in the brightness, I noticed the subtle traces of the night's chaos. A long scratch marred the side of the vehicle, the kind of mark no branch or stone could have made. A lantern that I was certain had been on the ground beside a tomb now sat missing, vanished as if swallowed by the fog itself. Several grave markers were slightly askew, their earth disturbed, though nothing appeared overtly violent. It was a cemetery restored to calm, but one that still carried the memory of what had occurred. The veteran night guard was waiting by the shed, arms crossed, eyes scanning the grounds. He didn't ask me how I'd been. Instead, in that measured, knowing tone, he said, "You followed the rules, right?" The question hung in the cool morning air, more of a statement than an inquiry. I nodded, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly, though not fully. My relief was tempered by an awareness that this was only one night, and that Hollow Grove had more rules, more tests. Waiting in the shadows, I stepped out of the patrol car, stretching muscles stiff from hours of rigid alertness. The caretaker emerged from the shed, quiet, methodical, carrying a small logbook. "Some nights," he said softly, "you survive by remembering, by obeying, by listening. Other nights," he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished, and the implication lingered in the chilled air. The cemetery was patient. It did not forget. It did not forgive. As I began to drive away, the fog had lifted enough for me to glimpse the familiar outline of the old chapel at the edge of the cemetery. And there, for a fraction of a heartbeat, I thought I saw a shadow slip behind the building, moving too quickly, disappearing too completely. My stomach tightened. Hollow Grove's lessons weren't over. The rules weren't just a set of instructions. They were a pact with survival itself, an understanding that each night could bring new dangers, new tests, new shifting rules. I took one last look at the cemetery, the rising sun painting the gravestones with golden light, a deceptive calm settling over the grounds. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and decayed leaves, a reminder of what had stirred during the night. My hands still trembled slightly, heart still pounding from adrenaline and fear. I realized that I had survived, but survival came with a cost, an awareness that I was only beginning to understand the depths of Hollow Grove, and that the rules I had clung to so desperately would continue to evolve, shape themselves around new dangers, new horrors. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. The cemetery faded into the distance, but the unease lingered. Hollow Grove was quiet for now, but I knew that tonight, or the next, it would awaken again. And when it did, the rules would matter more than ever. Even as the first light of dawn broke across Hollow Grove, a lingering unease followed me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The rules had guided me through the night, kept me safe when the world around me bent and shifted in ways I could barely comprehend. But I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Every night brought new challenges. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of movement could hold danger I had yet to see. And the rules themselves seemed to evolve, as if the cemetery were alive, watching, learning, and testing me in ways that no written protocol could fully anticipate. I couldn't help but wonder what might happen the next night. Would the east wing remain quiet, or would the whispers grow louder, bolder? Would new boundaries appear where none existed before? And would I recognize them in time? There were things I had not seen, things that moved just beyond the edge of vision, patiently waiting for someone careless or brave enough to draw near. Hollow Grove was patient, and it demanded respect. The rules were no longer mere instructions. They were survival in the truest sense. If you want to know the rest, you'd better stick around, because out here at Hollow Grove, the night is just getting started. And trust me, there are rules I haven't even told you yet. Some of them are more dangerous than anything I faced tonight. Others are impossible to explain. But one thing is certain. If you step into the fog, if you wander among the graves after dark, you'd better remember the rules, or you might not make it back at all. The sun rises, the mist fades, and for a brief moment, the world feels safe. But Hollow Grove never truly sleeps. And neither, it seems, will I.